The Flower Shop Block of the Month October Flowers. How to sew the quilt block keeper. The Flower Shop Block of the Month is a series of 12 panels with instructions, and every month you can make a new project. Cutting out. Take the fabric panel from your kit and open it out and give it a good press. If you have a look at it, you can see all the pieces are labelled. There's a formal flower display and a more informal bouquet that you can use on your project. All the pieces have labels above them, as you can see, and you need to cut out each one along the lines around the edge. All the seam allowances are included in these pieces. I've decided to use the informal flowers for the front of my quilt block keeper, but you can use the formal display if you like. You need to trim this as listed in the instructions. Then you will have all of the pieces, as you can see here, and I've pinned the label to the top edge of each piece so that I remember which way up the pieces go, and also so I can remember which piece is which. So you can see all the separate pieces are here. Including a large piece for the lining. Now you need to cut the brush cotton into the sizes listed in the instructions. If you cut round the edges with pinking shears, this will stop them from fraying, but also retain a flat edge, which is what you need when you're making the quilt block keeper. If you don't have pinking shears, then just work round the edge of them with a machine zigzag just to stop them from fraying, but give them a flat edge. So you've got 4 pages there. Brush cotton is ideal as it will cling to the fabric pieces that you're going to keep inside your block keeper. And then you have 2 page covers. And that's all your pieces ready and cut out. Making the cover front. Take the cover front centre that you've already trimmed and the cover front top outer and place this right sides facing along the top edge of the cover front centre. You can see here that I've trimmed the informal flowers display to the size listed in the instructions. Pin it together across the top, making sure you match all the raw edges, and then sew this together. Once that's done, press the seam open and flat. Now take the cover front bottom outer and place this right sides facing along the bottom edge of the cover front centre. Again, match up the raw edges down the sides and across the top edge. If you place a pin at one end and then place a pin at the other end, you can be sure that it matches up exactly. Then making sure the raw edges match up, pin it together in the centre. Now sew this together. Once it's sewn, press the seam open and flat. Now take one of the cover front outer side strips and place this right sides facing down the right hand side of the joined pieces. Turn it over so that you've got the seams on the top. You do it this way so that when you sew it together you can make sure that those seams stay open and flat. So by sewing with the seams uppermost, you can make sure that you don't accidentally turn them over. This will just make the front of your block keeper flatter. So pin it together at either end, making sure all the raw edges match, and then pop a pin in the centre to hold it all together. I'm also going to put a pin through the seam allowance just to hold it flat to make sure it stays like that while I'm sewing. It's just a bit easier, and then the machine foot doesn't get caught on it and turn it over. Then sew that into place. Take the other cover front outer side strip and sew that right sides facing down the other side, pinning into place and then sewing in the same way. Once that's done, you've completed your cover front outer, and as you can see here, all the seams have been pressed open and flat, and your cover front outer is complete. Making the cover outer. To give the block cover some structure, you can add wadding or foam to the cover. Wadding will give a soft finish, but foam will add extra stability. I've put wadding in mine. So place the cover front outer, cover back outer and cover spine outer right sides up on top of the wadding. Press or tack into place and then add quilting stitches through it in your chosen pattern. I've put diagonal stitches across the front and back and vertical stitches down the spine. Now take the spine and place it right sides facing down the left-hand side of the cover front outer and pin it into place, making sure you match the raw edges at the sides and along the top. You can use pins or clips for this, whichever you prefer. So pin it at either end and then pin it in a few places across the length just to make sure all the raw edges are matching up. I'm using my pins vertically here just because of the layers of wadding. I find it holds it better. Now stitch this together. Now once you've done that, take the cover back outer and sew that right sides facing to the other side of the spine edge. Again, pin it into place at the top and at the bottom, making sure the side and raw edges are matching up. So you're sewing the right hand side of the cover back outer to the other side of the spine outer. And basically the spine is going between the front outer and the back outer. Now sew this into place. Once you've done this, press these seams open and to make sure they're nice and flat, and this completes the cover outer. Making the cover lining. Join the cover front lining, the cover spine lining and the cover back lining together in one big piece in the same way as you did for the cover outer. So place the cover spine lining right sides facing down the left hand side of the cover front lining. Match all the raw edges down the sides and across the top and pin them together. Place a pin at either end and then place a pin in the centre. And then you sew this together. Take the cover back lining and place the right hand side of this right sides facing with the other side of the cover spine lining. This is exactly the same way as you did when you made the cover outer. Again, matching raw edges, pin it together along the top edge, put a pin at either end, pop a pin in the centre, and then sew the cover spine lining into place. Once you've done, it will look like this with the spine lining between the front and the back. Press the seams open and flat. And then this completes the cover lining. Making the page covers. Take one page cover and you now need to hem the two short sides and one long side by 1/2 inch. Because you've already trimmed them with the pinking shears, you only need to turn them over once. Now, if you measure 1 inch inwards from one short edge and place a pin, if you do it on your ironing board, you can just push the pins through. If you then fold the raw edge over to meet up with that pin, you've then turned it over by 1/2 inch. If you haven't used pinking shears, then you can just machine zigzag, but it does keep the pages a bit flatter and neater by only turning them over once, which is why I've trimmed them with pinking shears. Once you've turned and pressed it over by 1/2 inch, just pop some pins in to hold that turned over edge in place. Now, turn it round and you need to do the same with one of the long edges. So again, if you measure and mark with a pin, or you can use a pen for this if you prefer, 1 inch inwards from that raw edge, then turn it over and the raw edge to those marks, then you will have turned it over by 1/2 inch. Fold the corner over so that looks neat, you can just fold it over like this, or you can create a mitered corner by folding it into a point if you prefer. Press that into place and then pin it into place. So you can see with the corner, I've just made sure that it matches up and doesn't stick out beyond the edge of the side. But this brushed cotton does press really well because it's not too heavy and it turns over nicely. I just used a brushed cotton sheet for mine. This is a very more inexpensive way of buying the brushed cotton. I've already measured and pressed this side, so just give it an extra press, making sure it's turned over by ½ inch. I just did this in advance. Again, fold the corner over so it's nice and neat. Now machine sew down the side, across the bottom and up the other side to hem it. The top raw edge is left like this because that will be enclosed in a seam later. So now you've got the sides and one long edge hemmed neatly of the page cover. Take the other page cover, press and hem in exactly the same way. Adding the tab. Fold the tab piece in half widthways with right sides facing, matching the raw edges of the short sides, and pin together down across the side, then sew together along the short side and down one long side just like this. Then trim off the corner points at the top just to reduce the bulk. Now you need to take the male section of the magnetic clasp, that's this one here. Remove the back plate from it because you'll need to use that for measuring. Now measure 1/4 inch down from the seam, not from the raw edge but from the seam. Measure 1/4 inch down from the seam. You've still got the tab turned wrong sides out. Place the back plate on top of here so that the top of the back plate is at that 1/4 inch mark, and then make sure the back plate is placed centrally between that folded edge on the left and the seam on the right, not the raw edge but the seam on the right. This is because you want the magnetic clasp to be placed centrally once it's turned right sides out. Once you're happy that's done, draw lines through the slots of the back plate. Now you need to cut through these slots but only through the top layer of fabric. So if you fold it like this, use a seam ripper. You can use small scissors, but a seam ripper's better, making sure you only cut through the top mark section and not through the other side of the tab. Just double check on the back that you haven't cut through this. Now take the male section of the magnetic clasp and place this inside the tab. It'll fit fine because it's smaller than the tab. You just need to wiggle it in a bit and then push the prongs through those little cut slits you made. Lay this down flat and put the back plate on top so that you put the prongs through that. Then fold the prongs inwards. You have to fold them inwards for here, not outwards, otherwise it will be too big for the tab. Now turn the tab right sides out. It's a little bit fiddly to do this because of the clasp attached, but you can do it if you just work slowly. And then ease it and turn it right sides out, making sure the seams lie right along the edge, and give it a little press so that it's nice and neat. And now your tab has the magnetic snap neatly attached. Now take the cover outer and on the right side of the front of it, measure and mark the centre. You can fold it in half like I'm doing, or you can take a tape measure. So place a pin in the centre point of the outer. You can see this is the front cover. I'm going to just measure it just to be extra sure that it's in the centre. Now on this centre mark, measure 1 inch inwards from here. and mark this with a pen. Now take the female section of the magnetic clasp and remove the back plate. Place the centre hole in the back plate over that marked point and then draw through the vertical slots. Now you need to cut through these slots. Again, I'm going to use a seam ripper for this just because it's a bit more accurate. You've got to cut through the fabric and the wadding, so cut all the way through. Now take the female section of the clasp and push the prongs through. You can see here that I haven't managed to cut all the way through. So if you haven't done that, just take your seam ripper and cut through it again, or use some little scissors. Just make sure you only cut along the marked lines and not beyond. Now I've cut all the way through, I can push the prongs of the magnetic clasp through the slits, take the back plate, place that on top, and again, press the prongs inwards. You have to do this, otherwise they will stick out into the side. So now turn the cover over to the back section. So this is the back cover outer. And then you need to measure and mark the halfway point. You can do this by folding, or you can do it with a tape measure like I've done here. So measure halfway down, take the tab and make sure the magnetic clasp is on the top. Find the centre point of this by measuring or folding and pin it so it measures up with the centre point of the back outer, so that the tab is placed centrally down the back. Now before you sew it in place, just fold the cover together so the front and the back are level, and fold the tab over just to make sure it meets up exactly. You can adjust this if it doesn't. Once you're happy it meets up exactly so that it's all level, tack this into place. Assembling the cover. Place the cover outer and the cover lining wrong sides facing. Now match up all the raw edges and the spine seams and pin together. Start by matching up the spine seams. So if you make sure that the seam allowances are laying flat and open, pin together at the spine seams at the top. So just place the spine seams together to making sure they match up exactly. Pin them together at the top edge and then repeat this at the bottom edge. Make sure those seam allowances are laying flat and open as you pin them together. Once you've pinned it together and anchored it at the spine seams, then you can pin it together all the way around the edge. So make sure that you match up the raw edges of the lining with the outer all the way around, and remember they're wrong sides together. You'll find it easier if you pin together at the corners first. And then once you've pinned together at the corners, you can then place pins between those points. This will just help to make sure that it all matches up exactly. But they're the same size, so it will. But it just helps to get it even if you anchor it at the corner points first and then pin between. Adjust it as you go around just to make sure that the raw edges are matching. Now tack it together all the way around the edge. Use a longer stitch on your machine and do this within the seam allowance. Once that's tacked together all the way round, you now need to sew along the spine seams. It's important that these match up exactly. So if you push a pin through from the outside, make sure, turn it over, that it matches up exactly with the spine seam on the lining, and then place a horizontal pin across. Do this all the way around. So push a pin through the spine seam from the outside. Make sure it comes through exactly the spine seam on the inside. Place a horizontal pin to hold it, then you can remove that vertical pin. Do this in 2 or 3 places all the way up so that you can be sure they match up exactly. And when you push the pin through, if it doesn't match up with the lining, just move the lining over a little bit so that it does, and then you can then remove the vertical pin once you've anchored it with a horizontal pin. So do this all the way along, then sew it together down the spine seams. This will help to give the cover more structure. Now that's done, the spines all match up exactly. So now you can add the page covers. So take one page cover and place it right sides up on top of the lining. So that edge that you haven't hemmed goes at the top. Now the right hand side of the page cover needs to be positioned a 1/2 inch in from the right hand side of the page cover, and the left hand side needs to be placed a 1/2 inch in from the left hand spine seam. So you can see here it's 1/2 inch in from the right hand side, and then 1/2 inch in from the left. So you'll see it will overlap on top of the spine. Then making sure the raw edges of the page cover match up with the raw edges of the cover lining, pin it together all the way along. Now take the other page cover and repeat this in exactly the same way. So the unhemmed edge goes along the bottom. The left-hand side of the page cover is placed a 1/2 inch in from that left-hand side seam of where the spine is attached, and the right-hand side is placed a 1/2 inch inwards from the right-hand side of the page, of the cover. Measure these first before you plane them and place it. I've measured mine already, but make sure that you measure them. And then just adjust the edges so that the raw edges match up. Then sew the page covers into place across the pinned edges, so along the top and along the bottom. You will see that the page covers overlap. Once this is done, then fold the page covers back into place. Binding the edges. You need to join the 4 binding strips together to get the correct length. Take one binding strip and place it right sides up, and take another binding strip and place this right sides down on top at right angles. Mark where the corner meets the top strip, and then draw a diagonal line from that marked point to the top left-hand corner. Now place this strip back on top of the first strip, again right sides facing at right angles, matching raw edges, and pin it together either side of that drawn line. Then sew the 2 binding strips together along the drawn line. Once you've done that, open out that seam and press it nice and flat. Then trim the seam allowance to about 1/4 inch. It's just easier if you press it open first, because then it's easier then to keep that pressed open. And then just repress that seam that you've already done. Then repeat this to join all 4 strips together to make one long binding strip. The diagonal seams will reduce bulk and also make them less noticeable. Now take the cover that you made and place it with the cover lining right sides up. Now starting halfway along the back, I've just folded this in half, just approximately halfway along the back. Place a pin. Now take one end of your binding strip and fold it over by 1/4 inch to the wrong side, and pin this in place at that centre mark pin on the cover lining. So you're halfway along the back of the cover lining. Now making sure all the raw edges match up of the binding strip and the cover lining, pin the binding strip into place all the way down. Now you can see here that you're going to meet one end of the page cover. Because the page covers have been placed a 1/2 inch from the edge, then they will be well out of the way of this seam, but you need to make sure you keep them folded into place. Now pin it into place, the binding strip all the way down, and then just mark where the corner point is, where the bottom of the lining is, just with the pin so you can see where the corner, and then measure and mark 1/4 inch above the bottom of the corner of the lining. Now sew the binding in place all the way to this pin and stop with the needle down in the machine, and then sew diagonally, as you can see here, into the corner. Turn it all round and then fold the binding strip upwards so that the raw edge of the binding strip runs in a line directly down the other side of the lining, and pin that into place so you can see it forms a straight line, and keep the page cover out of the way. Now fold the binding strip back over again so that the top fold is level with the top edge, as you can see here, of the top raw edge, and pin it into place across the top. Now pin the binding strip down this next side. This is going to create a mitered corner. It's a really easy way to do it. If you take the time to sew one corner at a time like this, you'll get a nice, neat mitered corner. Now pin the binding strip in place all the way down here, again making sure the page cover is laying flat and you haven't caught any part of it in the seam. Sew it into place all the way down the edge until you reach the next corner, and miter it in the same way, and then continue doing that all the way around the cover until you get right back round to the other side. Now you can see here that I've overlapped the short end of the binding strip by about 1/4 inch on top of the folded end. Now all you have to do is fold the long edge under by 1/4 inch. You can see that I've got the cover right sides up at this stage. So the binding is being folded over onto the right side of the cover, turning the long edge over. Just make sure that when you turn it over, that folded under edge just covers the seam. Only just a little bit. When you get to the corners, because you've sewn that mitered corner, fold the long edges under and then just turn it over, and you'll find that it just naturally will create a mitered corner on the front as well as on the back. So continue doing this and pin the binding into place all the way round, folding the corners into miters as you go. Then you can top stitch from the right side, top stitch the binding into place all the way around the edge. Once you've done that, it will look like this. So this is the right side of the cover. You can see the edges are neatly bound. The page cover edges are all held into place. And you've got a nice mitered corners and a bound edge, which keeps the whole cover nice and neat. Adding the pages. Take the 4 pages that you've cut earlier and place them all on top of each other, making sure that all of those raw edges, so the edges that you've either cut with pinking shears or finished early with a zigzag stitch, make sure all the raw edges match up. It'll take a little bit of time to do this because the brushed cotton is quite light, but if you just work all the way around, match up the corners first. So if you make sure all 4 corners match up exactly, then pin them together. This is just to hold the pages together whilst you sew them to the cover. So pin them together, making sure they all match up. Now you need to draw a line centrally down through the top page. So measure across the length of the pages and mark the centre point. If you mark this in a few places, I've just done it at the centre, and then mark it at the top, and then measure a mark at the bottom. So this is to find the centre of the top page. Now take a long ruler and draw a line so that all these points meet up, so that you've got a line drawn vertically through the centre of the top page. I'm just using an erasable pen for this, but you could mark it with pins if you prefer. Now, to keep the pages together, pin through all 4 layers either side of the drawn line. I've placed these pins about an inch away from the drawn line because I want to keep them in place while I sew and not have to take them out. Make sure that you pin through all 4 pages so that you're keeping everything stabilised. So you've pinned the raw edges together, you've drawn the line, and by pinning it all through, you can be sure that all those 4 pages are lining up nice and neatly. Now just fold this up carefully and just pop it to one side. Take your quilt block cover and open it up so the lining is right side up, and fold the page covers so they're facing outwards and well out of the way for this stage. Now you need to measure and mark the centre of the spine, so the lining spine, because this is where you're going to sew the page covers. So if you place a pin or make a mark at the top and the bottom of the centre of it, you can do this just by measuring. Then take the page covers that you've already marked, and that drawn line, which is the centre of them, needs to match up with the centre mark of the spine. You'll find that it sits just below the page covers, as you can see here. So you can adjust that slightly so that the pages don't overlap onto the page covers, but just meet up to the seam, which is why you need to make sure they're folded well out of the way. So once you're happy that the pages are central and not overlapping the page covers at all, just lay them out flat with your hands again. So it's just touching the seam but not overlapping at the top and the bottom. Then the pins that you've placed in, you can move and repin it so that the pages are now pinned to the cover lining. Again, if you keep them well out of the way of the seam, about an inch is okay, then you can keep these in place whilst you sew. It just helps to keep everything stable. So you can see at the bottom edge, the pages just come up to the seam of the page cover but not overlapping it. Now sew it together all the way down, just like this. I started in the centre, sewed to the bottom, then sewed to the top and back again so that the start and finish was in the centre. It made it extra secure. Now your block keeper is finished. You can see it's all sewn together down the centre. So all you have to do now to store your blocks, I'm going to take one of the flower blocks from the panel, place that centrally onto a page, fold the page back over, and then fold the page covers on top. This helps to keep the pages in place, and you can place all your blocks or fabric pieces inside. Close the cover up and secure it closed with the tab, and your quilt block cover is complete.